Answer to Job by C.G. Jung. Prefatory note. The suggestion that I should tell you how Answer to Job came to be written sets me a difficult task, because the history of this book can hardly be told in a few words. I've been occupied with its central problem for years. Many different sources nourish the stream of its thoughts until one day, and after long reflection, the time was ripe to put them into words. The most immediate cause of my writing the book is perhaps to be found in certain problems discussed in my book Aeon, especially the problems of Christ as a symbolic figure and of the antagonism, Christ-Antichrist, represented in the traditional zodiacal symbolism of the two fishes. In connection with the discussion of these problems and of the doctrine of redemption, I criticize the idea of the Privatio Boni as not agreeing with the psychological findings. Psychological experience shows that whatever we call good is balanced by an equally substantial bad or evil. If evil is non-existent, whatever there is must needs be good. Dogmatically, neither good nor evil can be derived from man, since the evil one existed before man as one of the sons of God. The idea of the Privatio Boni began to play a role in the Church only after Mani. Before this heresy, Clement of Rome taught that God rules the world with a right and a left hand, the right being Christ, the left Satan. Clement's view is clearly monotheistic as it unites the opposites in one God. Later Christianity, however, is dualistic inasmuch as it splits off one half of the opposites, personified in Satan, and he is eternal in his state of damnation. This crucial question of whence evil forms the point of departure for the Christian theory of redemption. It is therefore of prime importance. If Christianity claims to be a monotheism, it becomes unavoidable to assume the opposites as being contained in God. But then we are confronted with a major religious problem, the problem of Job. It is the aim of my book to point out its historical evolution since the time of Job down through the centuries to the most recent symbolic phenomena, such as the Assumptio Mariae, etc. Moreover, the study of medieval natural philosophy, of the greatest importance to psychology, made me try to find an answer to the question, what image of God did these old philosophers have? Or rather, how should the symbols which supplement their image of God be understood? All this pointed to a complexio oppositorum, and thus recalled again the story of Job to my mind. Job, who expected help from God against God. This most peculiar fact presupposes a similar conception of the opposites in God. On the other hand, numerous questions, not only from my patients but from all over the world, brought up the problem of giving a more complete and explicit answer than I had given in Aeon. For many years I hesitated to do this because I was quite conscious of the probable consequences and knew what a storm would be raised. But I was gripped by the urgency and difficulty of the problem and was unable to throw it off. Therefore I found myself obliged to deal with the whole problem, and I did so in the form of describing a personal experience carried by subjective emotions. I deliberately chose this form because I wanted to avoid the impression that I had any idea of announcing an eternal truth. The book does not pretend to be anything but the voice or question of a single individual who hopes or expects to meet with thoughtfulness in the public. Lectori benevolo. I am distressed for thee, my brother. 2 Samuel 1:26. On account of its somewhat unusual content, my little book requires a short preface. I beg of you, dear reader, not to overlook it. For in what follows I shall speak of the venerable objects of religious belief. Whoever talks of such matters inevitably runs the risk of being torn to pieces by the two parties who are in mortal conflict about those very things. This conflict is due to the strange supposition that a thing is true only if it presents itself as a physical fact. Thus, some believe it to be physically true that Christ was born as the son of a virgin, while others deny this as a physical impossibility. Everyone can see that there is no logical solution to this conflict and that one would do better to not get involved in such sterile disputes. Both are right and both are wrong. Yet they could easily reach agreement if only they dropped the word physical. Physical is not the only criterion of truth. There are also psychic truths which can neither be explained nor proved nor contested in any physical way. If, for instance, a general belief existed that the river Rhine had at one time flowed backwards from its mouth to its source, then this belief would in itself be a fact, even though such an assertion, physically understood, would be deemed utterly incredible. Beliefs of this kind are psychic facts, which cannot be contested and need no proof. Religious statements are of this type. They refer without exception to things that cannot be established as physical facts. If they did not do this, they would inevitably fall into the category of the natural sciences. Taken as referring to anything physical, they make no sense whatever, and science would dismiss them as non-experienceable. They would be mere miracles which are sufficiently exposed to doubt as it is, and yet they could not demonstrate the reality of the spirit or meaning that underlies them, because meaning is something that always demonstrates itself and is experienced on its own merits. The spirit and meaning of Christ are present and perceptible to us even without the aid of miracles. Miracles appeal only to the understanding of those who cannot perceive the meaning. They are mere substitutes for the not understood reality of the Spirit. This is not to say that the living presence of the Spirit is not occasionally accompanied by marvelous physical happenings. I only wish to emphasize that these happenings can neither replace nor bring about an understanding of the Spirit, which is the one essential thing. The fact that religious statements frequently conflict with the observed physical phenomena proves that, in contrast to physical perception, the spirit is autonomous, and that psychic experience is to a certain extent independent of physical data. The psyche is an autonomous factor, and religious statements are psychic confessions, which in the last resort are based on an unconscious, i.e. on transcendental, processes. These processes are not accessible to physical perception, but demonstrate their existence through the confessions of the psyche. The resultant statements are filtered through the medium of human consciousness. That is to say, they are given visible forms which in their turn are subject to manifold influences from within and without. That is why whenever we speak of religious contents, we move in a world of images that point to something ineffable. We do not know how clear or unclear these images, metaphors, and concepts are in respect of their transcendental object. If, for instance, we say God, we give expression to an image or verbal concept which has undergone many changes in the course of time. We are, however, unable to say with any degree of certainty, unless it be by faith, whether these changes affect only the images and concepts or the unspeakable itself. After all, we can imagine God as an eternally flowing current of vital energy that endlessly changes shape just as easily as we can imagine him as an eternally unmoved, unchangeable essence. Our reason is sure only of one thing, that it manipulates images and ideas which are dependent on human imagination and its temporal and local conditions, and which have therefore changed innumerable times in the course of their long history. There is no doubt that there is something behind these images that transcends consciousness and operates in such a way that the statements do not vary limitlessly and chaotically, but clearly all relate to a few basic principles or archetypes. These, like the psyche itself, or like matter, are unknowable as such. All we can do is to construct models of them which we know to be inadequate, a fact which is confirmed again and again by religious statements. If therefore in what follows I concern myself with these metaphysical objects, I am quite conscious that I am moving in a world of images and that none of my reflections touches the essence of the unknowable. I am also too well aware of how limited are our powers of conception, to say nothing of the feebleness and poverty of language, to imagine that my remarks mean anything more in principle than what a primitive man means when he conceives of his God as a hare or a snake. But although our whole world of religious ideas consists of anthropomorphic images that could never stand up to rational criticism, we should never forget that they are based on numinous archetypes, i.e., on an emotional foundation which is unassailable by reason. We are dealing with psychic facts which logic can overlook, but not eliminate. In this connection, Tertullian has already appealed quite rightly to the testimony of the soul. In his De Testimonio Animae, he says, "These testimonies of the soul are as simple as they are true, as obvious as they are simple, as common as they are obvious, as natural as they are common, as divine as they are natural. I think that they cannot appear to anyone to be trifling and ridiculous if he considers the majesty of nature, whence the authority of the soul is derived. What you allow to the mistress you will assign to the disciple. Nature is the mistress, the soul is the disciple. What the one has taught, or the other has learned, has been delivered to them by God, who is, in truth, the master even of the mistress herself. What notion the soul is able to conceive of her first teacher is in your power to judge, from that soul which is in you. Feel that which causes you to feel. Think upon that which is in forebodings your prophet, in omens your augur, in the events which befall you your foreseer. Strange if, being given by God, she knows how to act the diviner for men. Equally strange if she knows him by whom she has been given." I would go a step further and say that the statements made in the Holy Scriptures are also utterances of the soul, even at the risk of being suspected of psychologism. The statements of the conscious mind may easily be snares and delusions, lies or arbitrary opinions, but this is certainly not true of the statements of the soul. To begin with, they always go over our heads because they point to realities that transcend consciousness. These entia are the archetypes of the collective unconscious, and they precipitate complexes of ideas in the form of mythological motifs. Ideas of this kind are never invented, but enter the field of inner perception as finished products, for instance, in dreams. They are spontaneous phenomena which are not subject to our will, and we are therefore justified in ascribing to them a certain autonomy. They are to be regarded not only as objects, but as subjects with laws of their own. From the point of view of consciousness, we can, of course, describe them as objects, and even explain them up to a point, in the same measure as we can describe and explain a living human being. But then we have to disregard their autonomy. If that is considered, we are compelled to treat them as subjects. In other words, we have to admit that they possess spontaneity and purposiveness, or a kind of consciousness and free will. This dual standpoint, which we are forced to adopt toward every relatively independent organism, naturally has a dual result. On the one hand, it tells me what I do to the object. On the other hand, what it does, possibly to me. It is obvious that this unavoidable dualism will create a certain amount of confusion in the minds of my readers, particularly as in what follows we shall have to do with the archetypes of deity. Should any of my readers feel tempted to add an apologetic only to the God images as we perceived them, he would immediately fall foul of experience, which demonstrates beyond any shadow of a doubt the extraordinary numinosity of these images. The tremendous effectiveness, mana, of these images is such that they not only give one the feeling of pointing to the ens realissimum, but make one convinced that they actually express it and establish it as a fact. This makes discussion uncommonly difficult, if not impossible. It is in fact impossible to demonstrate God's reality to oneself except by using images which have arisen spontaneously or are sanctified by tradition, and whose psychic nature and effects the naive-minded person has never separated from their unknowable metaphysical background. He instantly equates the effective image with the transcendental X to which it points. The seeming justification for this procedure appears self-evident and is not considered a problem so long as the statements of religion are not seriously questioned. But if there is occasion for criticism, then it must be remembered that the image and the statement are psychic processes which are different from their transcendental object. They do not posit it, they merely point to it. In the realm of psychic processes, criticism and discussion are not only permissible, but are unavoidable. In what follows I shall attempt just such a discussion, such a coming to terms with certain religious traditions and ideas. Since I shall be dealing with numinous factors, my feeling is challenged quite as much as my intellect. I cannot therefore write in a coolly objective manner, but must allow my emotional subjectivity to speak if I want to describe what I feel when I read certain books of the Bible, or when I remember the impressions I have received from the doctrines of our faith. I do not write as a biblical scholar, which I am not, but as a layman and physician who has been privileged to see deeply into the psychic life of many people. What I am expressing is first of all my own personal view, but I know that I also speak in the name of many who have had similar experiences. The Book of Job is a landmark in the long historical development of a divine drama. At the time the book was written, there were already many testimonies which had given a contradictory picture of Yahweh, the picture of a God who knew no moderation in his emotions and suffered precisely from this lack of moderation. He himself admitted that he was eaten up with rage and jealousy and that this knowledge was painful to him. Insight existed along with obtuseness, loving kindness along with cruelty, creative power along with destructiveness. Everything was there, and none of these qualities was an obstacle to the other. Such a condition is only conceivable either when no reflecting consciousness is present at all, or when the capacity for reflection is very feeble and a more or less adventitious phenomenon. A condition of this sort can only be described as amoral. How the people of the Old Testament felt about their God, we know from the testimony of the Bible. That is not what I am concerned with here, but rather with the way in which a modern man with a Christian education and background comes to terms with the divine darkness which is unveiled in the book of Job, and what effect it has on him. I shall not give a cool and carefully considered exegesis that tries to be fair to every detail, but a purely subjective reaction. In this way, I hope to act as a voice for many who feel the same way as I do, and to give expression to the shattering emotion which the unvarnished spectacle of divine savagery and ruthlessness produces in us. Even if we know by hearsay about the suffering and discord in the deity, they are so unconscious, and hence so ineffectual morally, that they arouse no human sympathy or understanding. Instead, they give rise to an equally ill-considered outburst of affect, and a smoldering resentment that may be compared to a slowly healing wound. And just as there is a secret tie between the wound and the weapon, so the affect corresponds to the violence of the deed that caused it. The book of Job serves as a paradigm for a certain experience of God, which has a special significance for us today. These experiences come upon man from inside as well as from outside, and it is useless to interpret them rationalistically and thus weaken them by apotropaic means. It is far better to admit the affect and submit to its violence than try to escape it by all sorts of intellectual tricks or by emotional value judgments. Although by giving way to the affect, one imitates all the bad qualities of the outrageous act that provoked it and thus makes oneself guilty of the same fault. That is precisely the point of the whole proceeding. The violence is meant to penetrate to a man's vitals, and he to succumb to its action. He must be affected by it, otherwise its full effect will not reach him. But he should know, or learn to know, what has affected him, for in this way he transforms the blindness of the violence on the one hand, and of the affect on the other, into knowledge. For this reason I shall express my affect fearlessly and ruthlessly in what follows, and I shall answer injustice with injustice, that I may learn to know why and to what purpose Job was wounded, and what consequences have grown out of this for Yahweh as well as for man. 1. Job answers Yahweh thus, Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer thee? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. And indeed, in the immediate presence of the infinite power of creation, this is the only possible answer for a witness who is still trembling in every limb with the terror of almost total annihilation. What else could a half-crushed human worm, groveling in the dust, reasonably answer in the circumstances? In spite of his pitiable littleness and feebleness, this man knows that he is confronted with a superhuman being who is personally most easily provoked. He also knows that it is far better to withhold all moral reflections, to say nothing of certain moral requirements which might be expected to apply to a god. Yahweh's justice is praised, so presumably Job could bring him his complaint and the protestation of his innocence before him as the just judge. But he doubts this possibility. How can a man be just before God? If I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. If it is a matter of justice, who can summon him? He multiplies my wounds without cause. He destroys both the blameless and the wicked. If the scourge lay suddenly, he will laugh at the trial of the innocent. I know, Job says to Yahweh, thou wilt not hold me innocent. I shall be condemned. If I wash myself never so clean, yet shalt thou plunge me in the ditch. For he is not a man, as I am, that I should answer him, and we should come together in judgment. Job wants to explain his point of view to Yahweh, to state his complaint, and tells him, Thou knowest that I am not guilty, and there is none to deliver out of thy hand. I desire to argue my case with God. I will defend my ways to his face. I know that I shall be vindicated. Yahweh should summon him and render him on account, or at least allow him to plead his cause. Properly estimating the disproportion between man and God, he asks, Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro, and wilt thou pursue the dry stubble? God has put him in the wrong, but there is no justice. He has taken away my right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast to my righteousness, and will not let it go. His friend Elihu the Buzite does not believe the injustice of Yahweh. Of a truth, God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. Illogically enough, he bases his opinion on God's power. Is it fit to say to a king, Thou art wicked, to princes, Ye are ungodly? One must respect the persons of princes and esteem the high more than the low. But Job is not shaken in his faith, and had already uttered an important truth when he said, Behold, my witness is in heaven, and he that vouches for me is on high. My eye pours out tears to God, that he would maintain the right of a man with God, like that of a man with his neighbor. And later, For I know that my vindicator lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. These words clearly show that Job, in spite of his doubt as to whether man can be just before God, still finds it difficult to relinquish the idea of meeting God on the basis of justice and therefore of morality, because in spite of everything, he cannot give up his faith in divine justice. It is not easy for him to accept the knowledge that divine arbitrariness breaks the law. On the other hand, he has to admit that no one except Yahweh himself is doing him injustice and violence. He cannot deny that he is up against a God who does not care a rap for any moral opinion and does not recognize any form of ethics as binding. This is perhaps the greatest thing about Job, that, faced with this difficulty, he does not doubt the unity of God. He clearly sees that God is at odds with himself, so totally at odds that he, Job, is quite certain of finding in God a helper, an advocate, against God. As certain as he is of the evil in Yahweh, he is equally certain of the good. In a human being who renders us evil, we cannot expect at the same time to find a helper, but Yahweh is not a human being. He is both a persecutor and a helper in one, and that one aspect is as real as the other. Yahweh is not split, but is an antinomy, a totality of inner opposites, and this is the indispensable condition for his tremendous dynamism, his omniscience, and omnipotence. Because of this knowledge, Job holds on to his intention of defending his ways to his face, i.e., of making his point of view clear to him, since notwithstanding his wrath, Yahweh is also man's advocate against himself when man puts forth his complaint. One would be even more astonished at Job's knowledge of God if this were the first time one were hearing of Yahweh's amorality. His incalculable moods and devastating attacks of wrath had, however, been known from time immemorial. He had proved himself to be a jealous defender of morality, and was specially sensitive in regard to justice. Hence he had always to be praised as just, which, it seemed, was very important to him. Thanks to this circumstance of peculiarity of his, he had a distinct personality which differed from that of a more or less archaic king, only in scope. His jealous and irritable nature, prying mistrustfully into the faithless hearts of men and exploring their secret thoughts, compelled a personal relationship between himself and man, who could not help but feel personally called by him. That was the essential difference between Yahweh and the all-ruling father Zeus, who, in a benevolent and somewhat detached manner, allowed the economy of the universe to roll along on its accustomed courses, and punished only those who were disorderly. He did not moralize, but ruled purely instinctively. He did not demand anything more from human beings than the sacrifices due to him. He did not want to do anything with human beings because he had no plans for them. Father Zeus is certainly a figure, but not a personality. Yahweh, on the other hand, was interested in man. Human beings were a matter of first-rate importance to him. He needed them as they needed him, urgently and personally. Zeus, too, could throw thunderbolts about, but only at hopelessly disorderly individuals. Against mankind as a whole, he had no objections, but then they did not interest him all that much. Yahweh, however, could get inordinately excited about man as a species and man as individuals if they did not behave as he desired or expected, without ever considering that in his omnipotence he could easily have created something better than these bad earthenware pots. In view of this intense personal relatedness to his chosen people, it was only to be expected that a regular covenant would develop which also extended to certain individuals, for instance to David. As we learn from the 89th Psalm, Yahweh told him, "My steadfast love I will keep for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him. I will not violate my covenant, or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David." And yet it happened that he, who watched so jealously over the fulfillment of laws and contracts, broke his own oath. Modern man with his sensitive conscience would have felt the black abyss opening and the ground giving way under his feet, for the least he expects of his God is that he should be superior to mortal man, in the sense of being better, higher, and nobler, but not his superior in the kind of moral flexibility and unreliability that do not jib even in perjury. Of course, one must not tax an archaic God with the requirements of modern ethics. For the people of early antiquity, things were rather different. In their gods there was absolutely everything. They teemed with virtues and vices. Hence they could be punished, put in chains, deceived, stirred up against one another without losing face, or, at least not for long. The man of that epoch was so inured of divine inconsistencies that he was not unduly perturbed when they happened. With Yahweh the case was different because from quite early on, the personal and moral tie began to play an important part in the religious relationship. In these circumstances, a breach of contract was bound to have the effect not only of a personal, but of a moral injury. One can see this from the way David answers Yahweh. "How long, Lord, wilt thou hide thyself forever? Shall thy wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. Wherefore hast thou made all men in vain? Lord, where are thy former loving kindnesses, which by thy faithfulness thou didst swear to David?" Had this been addressed to a human being, it would have run something like this. "For heaven's sake, man, pull yourself together and stop being such a senseless savage. It is really too grotesque to get into such a rage when it's partly your own fault that the plants won't flourish. You used to be quite reasonable and took good care of the garden you planted, instead of trampling it to pieces." Certainly our interlocutor would never dare to remonstrate with his almighty partner about this breach of contract. He knows only too well what a row he would get into if he were the wretched breacher of the contract, because anything else would put him in peril of his life. He must retire to the more exalted plane of reason. In this way, without knowing it or wanting it, he shows himself superior to his divine partner both intellectually and morally. Yahweh fails to notice that he is being humored, just as little as he understands why he has continually to be praised as just. He makes pressing demands on his people to be praised and propitiated in every possible way, for the obvious purpose of keeping him in a good temper at any price. The character thus revealed fits a personality who can only convince himself that he exists through his relation to an object. Such dependence on the object is absolute when the subject is totally lacking in self-reflection and therefore has no insight into himself. It is as if he existed only by reason of the fact that he has an object which assures him that he is equally there. If Yahweh, as he would expect of a sensible human being, were really conscious of himself, he would, in view of the true facts of the case, at least have put an end to the panegyrics of his injustice. But he is too unconscious to be moral. Morality presupposes consciousness. By this I do not mean to say that Yahweh is imperfect or evil like a Gnostic demiurge. He is everything in its totality. Therefore, among other things, he is total justice, and also its total opposite. At least this is the way he must be conceived if one is to form a unified picture of his character. We must only remember that what we have sketched is no more than an anthropomorphic picture, which is not even particularly easy to visualize. From the way the divine nature expresses itself, we can see that the individual qualities are not adequately related to one another, with the result that they fall apart into mutually contradictory acts. For instance, Yahweh regrets having created human beings, although in his omniscience he must have known all along what would happen to them. 2. Since the Omniscient looks into all hearts, and Yahweh's eyes run to and fro through the whole earth, it were better for the interlocutor of the 89th Psalm not to wax too conscious of his slight moral superiority over the more unconscious God. Better to keep it dark, for Yahweh is no friend of critical thoughts which in any way diminish the tribute of recognition he demands. Loudly as his power resounds through the universe, the basis of its existence is correspondingly slender, for it needs conscious reflection in order to exist in reality. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, even though, from sheer unconsciousness, he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious. And that is also why Yahweh needs the acclamation of a small group of people. One can imagine what would happen if this assembly suddenly decided to stop the applause. There would be a state of high excitation, with outbursts of blind destructive rage, then a withdrawal into hellish loneliness and the torture of non-existence, followed by a gradual reawakening of an unutterable longing for something which would make him conscious of himself. It is probably for this reason that all pristine things, even man before he becomes the canaille, have a touching, magical quality, for in its nascent state, each thing after its kind is the most precious, the most desirable, the tenderest thing in the world, being a reflection of the infinite love and goodness of the Creator. In view of the undoubted frightfulness of divine wrath, and in an age when men still knew what they were talking about when they said, "Fear God," it was only to be expected that man's slight superiority should have remained unconscious. The powerful personality of Yahweh, who in addition to everything else, lacked all biographical antecedents, his original relationship to the Elohim had long since sunk into oblivion, had raised him above all the noumena of the Gentiles and had immunized him against the influence that, for several centuries, had been undermining the authority of the pagan gods. It was precisely the details of their mythological biography that had become their nemesis, for with his growing capacity for judgment, man had found these stories more and more incomprehensible and indecent. Yahweh, however, had no origin and no past, except his creation of the world with which all history began, and his relation to that part of mankind whose forefather Adam he had fashioned in his own image as the anthropos, the original man, by what appears to have been a special act of creation. One can only suppose that the other human beings, who must also have existed at that time, had been formed previously on the divine potter's wheel, along with the various kinds of beasts and cattle, those human beings, namely, from whom Cain and Seth chose their wives. If one does not approve of this conjecture, then the only other possibility that remains is the far more scandalous one that they incestually married their sisters, for whom there is no evidence in the text, as was still surmised by the philosopher Karl Lamprecht at the end of the 19th century. The special privilege which singled out the Jews from among the divinely stamped portion of humanity and made them the chosen people had burdened them from the start with a heavy obligation. As usually happens with such mortgages, they quite understandably tried to circumvent it as much as possible. Since the chosen people used every opportunity to break away from him, and Yahweh felt it of vital importance to tie this indispensable object, which he had made godlike for this very purpose, definitely to himself, he proposed to the patriarch Noah a contract between himself on the one hand, and Noah, his children, and all their animals, both tame and wild, on the other. A contract that promised advantages to both parties. In order to strengthen this contract and keep it fresh in the memory, he instituted the rainbow as a token of the covenant. If, in the future, he summoned the thunderclouds which hide within them floods of water and lightning, then the rainbow would appear, reminding him and his people of the contract. The temptation to use an accumulation of clouds for an experimental deluge was no small one, and it was therefore a good idea to associate it with a sign that would give timely warning of possible catastrophe. In spite of these precautions, the contract had gone to pieces with David, an event which left behind it a literary deposit in the Scriptures, and which grieved some few of the devout, who, upon reading it, became reflective. As the Psalms were zealously read, it was inevitable that certain thoughtful people were unable to stomach the 89th Psalm. However that may be, the fatal impression made by the breach of contract survived. It is historically possible that these considerations influenced the author of the Book of Job. The Book of Job places this pious and faithful man, so heavily afflicted by the Lord, on a brightly lit stage where he presents his case to the eyes and ears of the world. It is amazing to see how easily Yahweh, quite without reason, had let himself be influenced by one of his sons, by a doubting thought, and made unsure of Job's faithfulness. With his touchiness and suspiciousness, the mere possibility of doubt was enough to infuriate him and induce that peculiar double-faced behavior of which he had already given proof in the Garden of Eden, when he pointed out the tree to the first parents and at the same time forbade them to eat of it. In this way he precipitated the fall, which he apparently never intended. Similarly, his faithful servant Job is now to be exposed to a rigorous moral test, quite gratuitously and to no purpose, although Yahweh is convinced of Job's faithfulness and constancy, and could moreover have assured himself beyond all doubt on this point, had he taken counsel with his own omniscience. Why then is the experiment made at all, and a bet with the unscrupulous slanderer settled without a stake, on the back of a powerless creature? It is indeed no edifying spectacle to see how quickly Yahweh abandons his faithful servant to the evil spirit, and lets him fall without compunction or pity into the abyss of physical and moral suffering. From the human point of view, Yahweh's behavior is so revolting that one has to ask oneself whether there is not a deeper motive behind it. Has Yahweh some secret resistance against Job? That would explain his yielding to Satan. But what does man possess that God does not have? Because of his littleness, puniness, and defenselessness against the Almighty, he possesses, as we have already suggested, a somewhat keener consciousness based on self-reflection. He must, in order to survive, always be mindful of his impotence. God has no need of this circumspection, for nowhere does he come up against an insuperable obstacle that would force him to hesitate and hence make him reflect on himself. Could a suspicion have grown up in God that man possesses an infinitely small yet more concentrated light than he, Yahweh, possesses? A jealousy of that kind might perhaps explain his behavior. It would be quite explicable if some such dim, barely understood deviation from the definition of a mere creature had aroused his divine suspicions. Too often already these human beings had not behaved in the prescribed manner. Even his trusty servant Job might have something up his sleeve. Hence Yahweh's surprising readiness to listen to Satan's insinuations against his better judgment. Without further ado, Job is robbed of his herds, His servants are slaughtered, his sons and daughters are killed by a whirlwind, and he himself is smitten with sickness and brought to the brink of the grave. To rob him of peace altogether, his wife and his old friends are let loose against him, all of whom say the wrong things. His justified complaint finds no hearing with the judge who is so much praised for his justice. Job's right is refused in order that Satan be not disturbed in his play. One must bear in mind here the dark deeds that follow one another in quick succession: robbery, murder, bodily injury with premeditation, and denial of a fair trial. This is further exacerbated by the fact that Yahweh displays no compunction, remorse, or compassion, but only ruthlessness and brutality. The plea of unconsciousness is invalid, seeing that he flagrantly violates at least 3 of the commandments he himself gave out on Mount Sinai. Job's friends do everything in their power to contribute to his moral torments, and instead of giving him, whom God has perfidiously abandoned, their warm-hearted support, they moralize in all too human manner, that is, in the stupidest fashion imaginable, and fill him with wrinkles. They thus deny him even the last comfort of sympathetic participation in human understanding, so that one cannot altogether suppress the suspicion of connivance in high places. Why Job's torments and the divine wager should suddenly come to an end is not quite clear. So long as Job does not actually die, the pointless suffering could be continued indefinitely. We must, however, keep an eye on the background of all these events. It is just possible that something in this background will gradually begin to take shape as a compensation for Job's undeserved suffering, something to which Yahweh, even if he had only a faint inkling of it, could hardly remain indifferent. Without Yahweh's knowledge and contrary to his intentions, the tormented though guiltless Job had secretly been lifted up to a superior knowledge of God, which God himself did not possess. Had Yahweh consulted his omniscience, Job would not have had the advantage of him, but then so many other things would not have happened either. Job realizes God's inner antinomy, and in the light of this realization, his knowledge attains a divine numinosity. The possibility of this development lies, one must suppose, in man's godlikeness, which one should certainly not look for in human morphology. Yahweh himself had guarded against this error by expressly forbidding the making of images. Job, by his insistence on bringing his case before God, even without hope of a hearing, had stood his ground and thus created the very obstacle that forced God to reveal his true nature. With this dramatic climax, Yahweh abruptly breaks off his cruel game of cat and mouse. But if anyone should expect that his wrath will now be turned against the slanderer, he will be severely disappointed. Yahweh does not think of bringing this mischief-making son of his to account, nor does it even occur to him to give Jacob at least the moral satisfaction of explaining his behavior. Instead, he comes riding along on the tempest of his almightiness and thunders reproaches at the half-crushed human worm. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without insight? In view of the subsequent words of Yahweh, one must really ask oneself, who is darkening what counsel? The only dark thing here is how Yahweh ever came to make a bet with Satan. It is certainly not Job, who has not darkened anything, and least of all a counsel, for there was never any talk of this, nor will there be in what follows. The bet does not contain any counsel, so far as one can see, unless, of course, it was Yahweh himself who egged Satan on for the ultimate purpose of exalting Job. Naturally, this development was foreseen in omniscience, and it may be that the word counsel refers to this eternal and absolute knowledge. If so, Yahweh's attitude seems the more illogical and incomprehensible, as he could then have enlightened Job on this point, which, in view of the wrong done to him, would have been only fair and equitable. I must therefore regard this possibility as improbable. Whose words are without insight? Presumably Yahweh is not referring to the words of Job's friends, but is rebuking Job. But what is Job's guilt? The only thing he can be blamed for is his incurable optimism in believing that he can appeal to divine justice. In this he is mistaken, as Yahweh's subsequent words prove. God does not want to be just, he merely flaunts might over right. Job could not get that into his head, because he looked upon God as a moral being. He had never doubted God's might, but had hoped for right as well. He had, however, already taken back this error when he recognized God's contradictory nature, and by doing so, He assigned a place to God's justice and goodness, so one can hardly speak of lack of insight. The answer to Yahweh's conundrum is therefore, it is Yahweh himself who darkens his own counsel and who has no insight. He turns the tables on Job and blames him for what he himself does. Man is not permitted to have an opinion about him, and in particular is to have no insight which he himself does not possess. For 71 verses he proclaims his world-creating power to his miserable victim, who sits in ashes and scratches his sores with potsherds, and who by now has had more than enough of superhuman violence. Job has absolutely no need of being impressed by further exhibitions of this power. Yahweh in his omniscience could have known just how incongruous his attempts at intimidation were in such a situation. He could easily have seen that Job believes in his omnipotence as much as ever, and has never doubted it or wavered in his loyalty. Altogether, he pays so little attention to Job's real situation that one suspects him of having an ulterior motive, which is more important to him. Job is no more than the outward occasion for an inward process of dialectic in God. His thunderings at Job so completely miss the point that one cannot help but see how much he is occupied with himself. The tremendous emphasis he lays on his omnipotence and greatness makes no sense in relation to Job, who certainly needs no more convincing, but only becomes intelligible when aimed at a listener who doubts it. This doubting thought is Satan, who after completing his evil handiwork has returned to the paternal bosom in order to continue his subversive activity there.